to keep to himself, speaking only when necessary. But those who had interacted with him knew one thing for sure. Baron Trump wasn't just another student. He was a prodigy, a young man whose intellect had left even seasoned professors in awe. Dr. Markham, known for weaving political commentary into her lessons, glanced toward the back of the room, her gaze lingering on Baron for just a moment too long. A smirk played at her lips as she turned back to the class. "Before we begin," she said, her voice carrying an air of authority, "let's discuss what truly matters in academia. After all, knowledge without the right principles is meaningless." Some students exchanged wary glances. They knew where this was going. Dr. Markham had a habit of singling out those who didn't align with her views, and today it seemed Baron was her chosen target. "Mr. Trump," she continued, folding her arms, "since you're here gracing us with your presence, perhaps you can answer a simple question. If you had to choose between critical thinking and blind obedience, which would you say is more valuable?" A few chuckles rippled through the lecture hall. The setup was obvious. She was baiting him, but Baron simply tilted his head, regarding her with a calm, unreadable expression. "That depends," he replied smoothly, his voice measured. "Are we discussing critical thinking in the pursuit of truth, or as a tool for reinforcing a predetermined narrative?" The room fell silent. A flicker of surprise crossed Dr. Markham's face, but she quickly masked it with an amused chuckle. "Ah, I see," she mused, pacing slightly. "You believe truth is objective. How quaint. But let's test that, shall we?" She turned to the whiteboard, swiftly jotting down a notoriously complex calculus problem, one even the top students in the EE class struggled with. "Since you value intellect so much, Mr. Trump, why don't you solve this?" she challenged, stepping aside with a smug expression. The class held its breath as Baron stood without hesitation. He walked to the front of the room, picked up a marker, and studied the problem for a mere few seconds before his hand moved with precision. Equations unfolded effortlessly under his grip, each step executed with an elegance that left students whispering in amazement. Within moments, he capped the marker and stepped back. Dr. Markham blinked. She stared at the board, her confidence faltering as she scanned his solution. It was flawless. Not just correct, but executed in a way that demonstrated an understanding far beyond the typical scope of even advanced students. A murmur spread through the room, some students exchanging incredulous glances, others suppressing grins. Baron turned to face her, his expression as composed as ever. "Would you like me to explain my reasoning, or is the answer sufficient?" For the first time, Dr. Markham seemed at a loss for words. The silence stretched before she finally cleared her throat and forced a stiff nod. "That won't be necessary." Baron returned to his seat without another word. But as he did, the message was clear. He hadn't just solved an equation. He had dismantled the very premise of her attempt to undermine him. And as the whispers in the lecture hall grew into hushed admiration, one thing became evident. She hadn't challenged just any student. She had challenged a genius, allows us to transform the integral into a more manageable form. Next, we apply a contour integration method inspired by the work of Cauchy. He paused, slightly glancing at the room before adding, "Of course, there's an alternative approach using residue theorem, but this method offers a more intuitive path to the solution." The class sat in complete silence. No rustling of notebooks, no whispered side conversations. Even the students who typically zoned out during lectures were locked in eyes, darting between the complex notations on the board and the unshaken young man. Explaining them, Dr. Markham's smirk had long vanished, replaced by something harder to define disbelief, perhaps maybe even a flicker of begrudging respect. Then, as Baron reached the final steps of his solution, he capped the marker, stepped back, and turned toward the class with the same calm expression that had never wavered and that he said simply is the solution. The room erupted whispers, scattered gasps. Even a few stunned Chuckles students exchanged glances as if silently confirming with one another that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Dr. Markham, however, remained silent. She stared at the board, analyzing his work, searching for an error, something she could use to reassert control over the situation. But there was nothing. Every line was correct, every step flawlessly executed. After what felt like an eternity, she finally spoke her voice, measured but lacking its earlier condescension. "Impressive, Mr. Trump," she said slowly, though her words seemed to take effort. Barron simply nodded before returning to his seat as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened, the class still buzzing in, the aftermath of what they had just seen. And in that moment, one thing was undeniable. Barron Trump hadn't just answered a question, he had turned a professor's attempt at public humiliation into a lesson far more powerful than any lecture that day. And as the class bell rang, signaling the end of the period, students left with more than just a newfound respect for their quiet, unassuming classmate. They left with a reminder that true brilliance speaks for itself, and no amount of bias or agenda could ever silence it, improving the learning environment. The class waited, eyes shifting between the professor and Barron. Dr. Markham swallowed hard, her pride battling her professionalism. Finally, with a slow nod, she stepped forward, picking up the marker once more. "All right, Mr. Trump," she said, her voice quieter but more measured. "Let's get back to calculus." A ripple of approval moved through the room. Students exchanged glances, some smiling, others shaking their heads in amazement. Even the dean, though still stiff with discomfort, gave a curt nod before stepping out of the room, sensing that the moment had settled into something constructive. And just like that, the power struggle dissolved. Not in humiliation, but in progress. Barron had done more than prove his intellect. He had demonstrated leadership, humility, and a deep respect for learning. From that day forward, the class was different. Dr. Markham, though still holding on to her beliefs, kept them separate from her lectures. The students, inspired by the moment, engaged more deeply with the material. And Barron? He continued to sit quietly in the back, helping classmates when needed, letting his brilliance speak for itself. Because in the end, true intellect doesn't demand respect. It earns it. The dean watched intently, fully aware that this moment could either spiral into a PR disaster or turn into something unexpectedly transformative. Dr. Markham looked at Barron, then at her students, really looked at them perhaps for the first time. What she saw in their faces forced her to make a decision that would change everything. Her voice was barely audible when she finally spoke. She hesitated, then straightened her shoulders. "I've made a terrible mistake." The admission seemed to cost her, but something had shifted in her demeanor. "For years, I've been so focused on fighting perceived privilege that I became exactly what I claimed to oppose, someone who judges based on preconceptions rather than merit." She turned to Barron. "You didn't just solve that equation. You taught me something about true leadership." The dean, sensing an opportunity, stepped forward. Perhaps this could become a model for other departments. But before he could spin this into an administrative success, chaos erupted outside. A crowd had gathered in the hallway. Students from other classes who had been watching viral videos in real time. Some held hastily made signs scribbled on notebook paper. "Teach math, not politics," and "merit over bias." The situation teetered on the edge of spiraling out of control. Then, once again, Barron took the lead. Walking to the door, he addressed the growing crowd, his voice carrying a natural authority. "If you're here because you want to learn, then come in. There's plenty of room." Students flooded in, filling every available space. Dr. Markham watched in amazement as Barron turned back to the board, marker in hand. "Now," he said, "who wants to learn about real-world applications of calculus?" What happened in that classroom over the next hour would become university legend. But the real story wasn't about equations or politics. It was about something far more powerful. In the weeks that followed, enrollment in the advanced calculus class tripled. Students weren't just coming to learn math, they were coming to witness a remarkable partnership. Dr. Markham, humbled by the experience, returned to her true passion for mathematics. Barron, true to his word, began hosting study sessions that bridged the gap between theoretical knowledge and real-world application. But the most significant change wasn't in the curriculum, it was in the culture. The class became a place where questions were encouraged, where merit truly mattered, and where learning